Afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Using Valuations in Technology Transfer, presented by the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer. My name is Sarah Germain. I'm the FLC's Professional Development Manager, and I will be your staff host today. All lines have been muted to ensure high quality audio, and today's session is being recorded. If you have a question for the panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature. If you have a technical question, you may use that feature as well. I now have the pleasure of introducing you to today's distinguished speaker. Stephen M. Ferguson currently serves as the Special Advisor at the NIH Office of Technology Transfer, where he has worked since 1990. The Biomedical Technology Transfer Program at NIH is one of the world's largest, with a portfolio that includes about 1,700 active licenses with aggregate sales greater than $6 billion per year that is based upon research that has also generated 34 FDA-approved drugs and vaccines. A former chemist at the National Cancer Institute and biotech industry product manager, Mr. Ferguson holds master's degrees in business administration from George Washington University and chemistry from University of Cincinnati, as well as a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Case Western Reserve University. A registered patent agent and certified licensing professional, Mr. Ferguson is faculty and technology transfer department chair at the Foundation for Advanced Education in the Sciences graduate school at NIH and the Biotechnology Industry Organization Bio Bootcamp. He also serves as a business reviewer or advisory board member for the U.S.-India Science and Technology Endowment Fund, the Maryland Industrial Partnerships, Maryland Innovative Initiative, Virginia BioLife Science Gap Fund, the Journal of Commercial Biotechnology, and the DoD Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. He has published extensively in the field of technology transfer and has also received the Autumn President's Award, the Autumn Volunteer Service Award, the NIH Director's Award, the FAES Instruction Award, 4 Deal of Distinction Awards, and the Frank Barnes Mentoring Award from the Licensing Executive Society, 6 Federal Laboratory Consortium Awards, and 15 NIH Merit Awards in recognition of his service and activities in technology transfer. Please join me in welcoming Steve Ferguson.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, where I'm going to be talking about using valuations in technology transfer. Now, as federal lab people or tech transfer people at institutes or academic centers, we're really focused, of course, on product development and bringing the products to market, but it's part of that, and it seems like it always sometimes comes down to the money, and so the valuation is a very important part of it, and so I hope to give you a little bit of a taste of that today and sort of get you thinking a little more critically, a little more substantially about how you can use valuations to enhance and improve your activities that you're doing for your various research organizations and agencies. So let's get started. Here we go. So first of all, let's talk about why is valuation a useful skill in technology transfer? Well, if we have to think about it, we have the unique position or the functionality of writing being at the intersection of law, of science, and business, and that's what keeps it very interesting and active for us. But as part of this overall activity, we're going to be able to use valuation, use our valuation skills to sort of make sense of all this in terms of take inputs from both the science, the legal aspect, particularly patent law, contract law, and business to really function as a technology transfer. So using valuation, therefore, is an important part of this because it really helps us do our job and really makes this intersection, this crossroads that we serve as, really work very well for us. So why would you want to do a technology evaluation? Well, first of all, as technology transfer managers, you'd like to have a better control over the overall process. You know, your limited resources and your tech transfer programs and your individual efforts. So you'd like to concentrate as much as you can on technologies that have high potential in terms of impact and high potential in terms of value, because those things will kind of go hand in hand. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that hopefully you'll have some license negotiations with these technologies that you're working on. Obviously, patenting is not the be-all and end-all, but really a means to an end. And the end is really to transfer the technology. And part of this is going to be in the license negotiation. And this is where the valuation becomes important. And doing that, you'll use your knowledge of the market that in terms of talking with a prospective licensee, talking with your inventor. But you have to remember that getting the valuation reasonably correct, going to be a good deal. If it's too high or too low, there's going to be people that are going to try to walk out of it. So a good valuation is a good long-term pathway to consuming a good deal, consummating a good deal, and bringing the product to market. Other thing you'd like to do is somehow be able to project a little bit in terms of future royalties and product outcomes. Your boss probably would like to know this. Some agency that may be using some royalty funds would like to know this. And you'd like to have some idea that, well, what could be some success stories that we would have downstream to put in your FLC annual report or other types of reporting things that really kind of measure the outcomes of your program. You have to keep it in mind, though, is that we will do a lot of these calculations, but the classic definition of value is a willing buyer, a willing seller, each having relevant information. So this is going to be an important part of our discussion today. So first of all, you have to take an inventory a little bit of what you have to value. So often we think of patent rights, and certainly that's a key component for longer term value and for higher sort of product types of activities. We also may have biological materials, particularly those of us in the life sciences, can be very important. We'll have know-how and expertise from the laboratory, and that could translate a little bit into CRADAs, perhaps, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement. And you also have the future rights that could also translate into Cooperative Research and Development Agreements or CRADAs. And sometimes these are useful for developing early stage technology that may have better value after you've done some of this work through these collaborations. Other types of things that come into the discussion could be exclusivity. Obviously, exclusive license is worth more than a non-exclusive license, usually at least twice as much. If you're in the life sciences area, you're going to looking at the preclinical or clinical data that maybe your program has. It's often, we're particularly early stage, but often we'll have some preclinical data and sometimes even clinical data, and certainly that is a major indicator of value. The other thing to think about is the reputation quality. In terms of reputation of the data, the publication that maybe the discovery has made in, and the overall reputation, the scientific reputation of the agency or the laboratory. Famous one obviously will draw a lot of attention, and that represents a higher valuation that you can put on overall project. So how can you start? What's some of the start? How does these things get started in terms of doing evaluation? Well, first of all, of course, our scientists send us an invention disclosure. At NIH, we call them EIRs, Employee Invention Reports. And when we see these, they're very detailed on the science. They're often sort of a pre-publication, kind of a manuscript draft that the scientist is working on. But it's a little light on sort of commercial utility. So it's a little heavy, not so much light on technology. It's actually probably heavier on the detailed science, but the technology application is a little bit light. And so we don't have a really good sense of what the product is. We have maybe a hint, a guesstimate, sort of a distant vision. And we don't have a value proposition. The value proposition is that why is it quicker, better, faster? Why would anyone really care about this technology? So it's a little light on that. On the other hand, we have to contrast with our industry partners. They license or they buy products that are very focused on user orientation, meaning to be able to put it to practical use in their program, have clear benefits, and are competitive in the marketplace. So it's kind of a contrast. We're trying to match up something that's very early with a customer that really prefers things a little bit late. So that's a little bit of a disconnect, and somehow we're going to have to cross that divide and really show the value. So what might be the step one for this? Well, first of all, try to understand the technology itself and think about, in discussions with the inventor or with your contract law firm that's maybe filing the application for you, what kind of products can become from this? What may be some of the things that could come from this in terms of solutions to pressing problems, both in life science or healthcare, or if you're in physical science, in physical science industries and such, and be able to communicate that value to someone else. Second is that you really want to give the customer, in this case the company, the licensee, a reason to move forward. So you really want to look at the technology from the perspective of the customer. Why would a customer be interested in it? Why would a company want to take the risk and assume a product development that may be many years from reaching the marketplace? So the most important thing here is, how are they deciding to go on their projects? How would they pick yours as opposed to someone else? So you think about this. So in terms of customer focus, the customers aren't really thinking about this as a really interesting science paper or a incremental improvement in laboratory work. They're looking on something that are more product oriented. So they're looking to satisfy some sort of attributes that so they can transfer this to the marketplace. So the challenge here is for you to match the value, the idea of your science with the value and idea of what a customer would really want. And the more closely aligned your technology is to the customer need, the stronger the value proposition, the stronger they'll be interested in it, the quicker they'll market. And that's why sometimes early stage technologies sometimes need collaborations and stuff to really move forward in the marketplace. But that's all something you probably have realized by now, but it's an important part to think about and keep in mind as you're looking at the value of a given technology. Third step, and perhaps the most important, is that you've got to communicate the value. Make sure that you highlight the valuable aspects of the idea coming from the laboratory, so that a customer who's maybe has a lot of different things that they're looking at, a lot of messages that they receive, a lot of proposals, something that will stick out, something that will really address what their spots are, their problem spots are. So what do you think the product's going to be? And what's the unmet need? Yeah, think about this. So you're going to describe the technology and how it works, but you're not really going to go into a lot of detail. You want the basic concepts so someone looking at this can kind of have a general understanding of how it works, not necessarily always the enabling detail, but basically how it works and what are the things that distinguish it scientifically from what currently exists. Exactly why did your inventor come up with this? What problems were they trying to solve? Why isn't there already a solution in the marketplace? Focus in on that. So again, you don't want to go into a great detail, and you don't need a lot of scientific abbreviations or jargon at this point. Those can come in kind of the references that you might cite, but focus on what's really important, and make sure that you have the value proposition. Without the value proposition, well, sorry to say, you don't really have any value here. So if there's no value proposition, there's no value. So you really want to focus on that. So will prospective licensees care about the valuation that you do? You're looking at all of this. You're spending some time talking, as I mentioned, with the inventor. You're probably doing some market research, doing with your agency library or other public sources. We'll talk about that. But will they care? I think they will care, because, as I mentioned here, in a basic way, evaluation is an essence of business. Business people are always putting a value on something because it's impossible to really sell or exchange something tangible or intangible in the business without estimating its value. And intellectual property and license agreements that you would have with a federal agency, they're a business asset. So of course, there are some values. They're expecting to place a value, and you having a value on it as well. Well, that's the way to start the discussion, and it can help you very much as well. So what's the valuation of assets? And here we're going to be talking about both intangible and IP or intellectual property as well. And so it's the process of determining the economic or business value of an asset. So it's, again, it's not looking at it from a scientific perspective. By doing a business valuation of an asset coming to a research program, you're not critiquing the investigator science. You're not part of their program review or making any sort of scientific judgments or commenting on their engineering ability if it's in the physical science. It's really more about the economic aspect. And so it's an important part of the process, but again, it's not something that the inventor should take offense about, because it's actually something that's sort of as a built out from what their basic research has done. So let's take a look at this. So the business value of assets, again, we're talking about intangibles, and intellectual property is an intangible asset. So we're talking really about the monetary compensation expected to receive from the sale or exchange or licensing of the asset. So it's a little hard sometimes to think about this, because the exchange is something that's often part of a negotiation. There isn't always a reference book that you would look for, some sort of scientific values or physical science values. There is some reference book you look at. It's going to be an estimate that you're going to receive from the exchange or sale, and that's going to be part of a negotiation. So this works by usually we have two parties. Sometimes we have multiple parties in some of our transactions, but usually two parties, a buyer and a seller, a licensee and a licensor, and they arrive at two different values for the same asset. They may use different methodologies, parameters, but the important thing is that both parties are doing it, and that's why negotiations are needed. That's what negotiations are about, to arrive at agreed upon price. So what you don't want to do is come up to a valuation where you're kind of pulling the numbers out of the air. Because there you're just totally guessing. And well, maybe if it's a low value, it doesn't really matter. But things that are significantly important, you really have some sort of factual or reasonable basis. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Get your feet wet in this, get some comfort for this as you enter into these types of negotiation. Because that's going to be the first question after you establish the need between the parties, is that what's the value? What's going to be exchanged as part of this trading of the intellectual property or materials to the licensee for value? What's it going to cost? So again, if speaking in monetary terms, it's going to be the amount actually received. So you're going to the price. In some cases, it will be the same price as the buyer pays, and that's be an efficient market. And usually, we're talking about here is an efficient market, though it's not quite the same as sort of the stock market or that type of activity. But an agreement between a federal lab, typically, and a company will have this sort of monetary compensation. There could be other types of compensation, other values as part of the equation. It doesn't always have to be money, but you want to have a sense of the overall value in terms of what's being exchanged and how these assets are being transferred. So this is really important. In terms of the business assets, you've all seen the stories about companies such as Tesla or Amazon, companies that have very strong valuations, but most of their assets are are actually not tangible. So you have the classic things like steel plants, automobile manufacturing, has a lot of tangible assets in terms of property, plant, equipment, maybe cash from sales to customers. You contrast that with intangible assets. So here we have, in essence, the things we're dealing with in terms of technology transfer, though occasionally we are licensing tangible assets, as I mentioned before, in terms of biological materials and such. But often we're working with intangibles. This is really particularly in terms of technology, intellectual property. We don't, as federal labs, we don't license trade secrets or know-how, but they're certainly part of the overall package that, in terms of what we're providing our partners through collaborations, a little bit in the area of trademarks, perhaps. Goodwill is actually really important. You think about the reputation of the agency, the reputation of the scientist. That's actually quite valuable, even though we don't endorse a particular product. The idea that the idea came from a national laboratory, came from a lab that's has peer-reviewed publications. That's all part of the process. So here we have sort of a change in assets where historically very focused on assets on physical assets, and now we're seeing increasingly more focus on intangible assets. And I think this is where the federal labs have strong presence in terms of technology, intellectual property, and provide this type of activity for these types of companies. Good partner for that type of activity. So when do you do this? When is a company looking at valuations of intangibles? Which of course includes intellectual property. Well, they're looking at some of the things that you read about in the press in terms of if you've been working in a company, that these are part of this. Obviously, mergers and acquisitions, we see a lot of that activity in terms of some of the partners that we have in terms of technology transfer. Could be selling of certain assets, could be for tax considerations, looking at funding from venture capitalists, particularly if we're licensing assets to a startup where a startup is being formed around some of the intellectual property coming from a research program. Investment banks looking at it from intellectual property, and of course licensing. So these are all probably the 6 major aspects of this where valuations of intangible assets are needed. I put on the line, I put litigation. Hopefully you don't have to go there, but often as part of litigation, infringement, other types of activities, there's also valuations put in there. And I have some colleagues who have done pretty well in their tech transfer careers involved with sort of as being special experts for litigation concerns. And certainly sometimes litigation, you can pull valuations from litigation because of the published court decision. So these are all part and process. So we hope we don't end up doing too much in litigation. We hope we're more focused on these things above the red line, but all part and parcel in terms of finding valuations or why valuations are important for people in business or working with businesses. So again, why valuations needed? As I mentioned before, on the corporate side, because the company needs to manage the assets that they have in order to make sort of good business decisions, good strategies. It's a very dynamic market in business, whether it's life sciences or physical science, a very rapidly changing environment, both in terms of business, of science, even legal aspects are sometimes dynamic. So our company partners have to really be on their toes to really make important day-to-day decisions and also long-term strategic decisions and keeping track of valuations. So as licensing professionals, from federal labs, trying to sort of work with corporations and other business partners, we need valuation because we need to have some sort of basis for our negotiations. And that's because if we have some facts and some figures, some information, we are more effective in negotiators. We'll have better deals, better long-term relationships, and hopefully products and activities on the marketplace based upon this, if in fact we can work with this from a factual basis rather than emotion. And by doing this, we'll increase your credibility, trustworthiness, and I think both parties will have confidence in the process. You'll have a better chance for better results. We know that the failure rate for agreements, the failure rate of companies is high, so you really need to sort of be able to put a lot of agreements through. At the same time, the better quality ones are more likely to survive the turbulence that we see in the marketplace. So this is really important. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's probably best that the valuations are done not by the inventor, because we, as tech transfer professionals, we have knowledge of the activity, but we don't have a financial interest in the outcome. So we're less likely to be emotionally involved with this activity and then can focus on credibility, trustworthiness, and confidence in the process. A good place for us. So I'm going to be talking a little about, just give you a little bit of a taste, have you stick your toes in the water, so to speak, in sort of 5 sort of major methods of valuation. We won't go into a lot of detail in our time here, but we'll give you a little bit of a sense of some of the things. And again, as I'll reemphasize, you can try more than one of these, because really what you're doing is kind of getting a ballpark. And each of these will get you in some kind of ballpark, and hopefully you'll get an idea then of some relative merits of doing valuations, and also where you might want to be in terms of the outcome. So I have to warn you, it combines both art and science. And as scientists, we're very used to having nice equations to grind out the answer, nice algorithms. Not the case here. There's a little bit of art to it as well. And as I mentioned before, different approaches will give different numbers. So you kind of have to do a combo here. Mix and match and kind of see where you are in overall activity. But again, to give you some sort of basis for the negotiation and hopefully concluding your negotiating the agreement. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the market approach. Market approach is probably the most useful, particularly for early stage technologies. And here we're just going to be looking around. We're going to find comparables. We're not inventing the thing, but we're finding something that's just very similar. It's done by someone else, maybe by our program, or maybe by a similar industry partner, and just kind of use that as comparable. And so it's really kind of a key function, and it's very useful. It's probably the most popular way to go about it. So in doing that, we have to talk a little bit about it. We go back to the discussion about tangibles versus intangibles. So tangibles, the market approach is actually pretty efficient, pretty easy. There's blue books. You can look up the value of your car. You can go online and check a couple of sources for value of your house, real estate, stock market. You can check online or in the newspaper. You see these because very efficient marketplaces. IP, not the case. We don't see IP valuations online. We can't go to look up in the newspaper any sort of transactions where our patent is, up or down in value. So it's not quite as easy. So this is what makes a little difference. That makes it a little more challenging for us, unless it makes it a little less exact, but something to keep in mind. So in terms of where you could go in looking for this, I've put together some sources of comparable transactions. One interesting one is, of course, one that comes from the government itself, the Security Exchange Commission's, the EDGAR database, where companies will often file copies of their license agreements as part of their regulatory filings, particularly for transactions that are material to a company. so investors know about things. And sometimes these are redacted, sometimes partially redacted, sometimes unredacted, or they become unredacted for a certain period of time. So using the SEC website, you can find some sort of these sort of transactions you can find for a company, similar product, perhaps technology or certain partnership from what you're doing. Very, very important source of information. And there are also companies that also pull these agreements out of the SEC and work with them more, and you can actually do that as well. So I have here two sources for both those of you in the physical science and those of you in the life science. Now these are all sources that charge for their activity, but you can kind of, again, check them out. Sometimes it's a subscription, sometimes it's a fee per agreement. There's an agreement you're trying to track down, well, maybe they have it from sources, and they often will have annotation and discussion for it. So these are all things that where a lot of effort has gone into sort of tracking down and putting together packages of comparable things so you can look them up in a database if you're a subscriber, or maybe your library will have access to some of these as well. So the other one could be to do evaluation. Another thing would besides you could use some of the sources in some of the professional society databases and deal term surveys. So a couple places to look here would be the AUTUM, Association of University Technology Managers, the Transact database, and the Licensing Executive Society, LES, each year has a global life sciences and also periodically physical science types of royalty rates and deal term surveys. So become a member of those two groups and check out their database on their website to do some checking for that. And I'll be showing some examples of this in just a minute. And then of course, don't forget your own internal database. At NIH, we have more than 30 years of NIH transactional data. That includes also some transactional data from our colleagues at the FDA and CDC. In our own internal base, our database, which is currently TechTracks. And through that, you can find, at least if you're part of NIH, a lot of experience. So don't forget that you probably might have some information in your own internal database. And it's a good reason to have such a thing because it's such a valuable resource going forward, both in terms of company history and also your own history in terms of working with certain types of technologies, certain types of agreements. Another thing to look for is to talk with colleagues. One good place is to connect with people on TechnoL, which has been around for quite a number of years. And in terms of asking for contacts, see if anybody in the community, the licensing and tech transfer community, might be able to provide some information or have some insight in a particular industry or partner. And this because it's not part of a professional society, there's no issues related to sort of antitrust issues that might come up if you're doing this type of discussion on, say, AUTUM or LES type of databases. So it's a free public service, and it's been around for quite a while, so it's pretty well known. So that's the first approach. Let's go into the second approach, would be the cost approach. And here is the cost of what you're trying to license, the cost of the material that you're trying to sort of exchange with a company. So here, the easiest place would be to talk with your inventors, the people who spent the money to develop the material, and do some arithmetic. And you can here include both the direct cost in terms of what it actually physically costs them, and also indirect in terms of the indirect costs that go involved with it as well. And that's in terms of heating or building costs or the other assets that indirectly were utilized in terms of making the idea or making the product go forward. So the cost approach, one perspective would be the licensee perspective. So here it's kind of, they read your paper, there's no patents And what's the cost of them sort of reproducing that work? I mean, it could be in a licensed IP perhaps, but often it's on just materials that are unpatented. So it's the actual cost. So what's the cost for them to do it? And you also have to say a delay factor. It's going to take them a few months perhaps to replicate, or will it only take a few weeks or a few days to replicate what you've done? So sometimes for them, time is money, particularly maybe in the pharma industry where getting a product to market before a patent term expiration is worth millions of dollars each month. So a few $1,000s in licensing fees to save that time is fine. So it's kind of a make versus buy decision. And you'll see that often larger firms are very readily will make the decision to buy or license. Smaller firms may quibble, but for larger firms, time is money and they'll move forward with this. From a licensor perspective, well, you don't really just want the cost, you want the cost plus some sort of a little bit of extra. And we don't really call it profit necessarily in terms of federal labs, but you kind of consider profit a little bit, and then you're going to get a little extra above the cost to reward the inventors, reinvest in other types of activities, but that's sort of the idea anyway. So what goes into the cost? I mentioned a few things, but let's just go down the list and you can kind of see. Well, obviously there'll be the R&D costs, both the labor and overhead. If you had some sort of testing or regulatory aspects with this, what was the regulatory cost for that? Particularly if you're going to be transferring regulatory assets in terms of cross-referencing or master cell banks or other types of activities. Part of it, if you've had patent protection for it, well, what does it cost you for that? That's certainly not an inexpensive activity these days, as we all know. And did you have to buy some special equipment to make it? What kind of capital improvements did you have to make, either to your building or whatever for that? And you can also think about, well, what's the opportunity cost for diverted resources? So rather than doing something else, you did this. So what's the cost for that? What goes into that? So when would you use that? Well, first of all, it's probably more useful when you can actually estimate it. That these aren't always things that people have top of mind or easy access to. In negotiations, it might be a basis for, well, what's going to be our upfront royalties when signing an agreement? If you'd like to get those costs back. We see at NIH, we have internal use license agreements where it's going to be internal R&D type of activity at our licensee, not selling, but internal work, and particularly for biological materials. So you can kind of say, well, transfer a certain amount of certain grams of material, the cost was X. And so that could be a basis for that. So in general, it's useful for early stage, and the future market's not really known because you know what your cost is, you don't really know what the future utility might be. The weaknesses, of course, is that it is only the cost. It's just a reimbursement sort of cost plus, and not really intrinsic value of the discovery, of the intellectual property of the materials. It's not really capturing any sort of success coming from it. Then it also, it doesn't typically account for wasted costs. We all know from laboratory experiments that there's more typical experiment doesn't work. So you've got a lot of costs perhaps in that you haven't perhaps counted for in terms of wasted material. So again, something you can use, it's not guaranteed. So in terms of cost as evaluation, you can see it very commonly. It's very used by scientists, administrators, when you can track the research dollars, but it can create expectation problems. People, if you've really spent a lot of money on it and there's not really much interest, or the interest is at a much lower cost, you can see that could create some problems. So you have to think about this. And if there's no recovery, well, then the value is zero. So of course, that's another problem for you. And so the science is really good. Is it really the values just the some costs? No, I think it's much more than that. So again, it's not a perfect method. A third method would be so-called rules of thumb. Again, you're looking within, but you have some sort of guidance, some sort of experience, some track record here to go with. So looking at our own databases, for example, we've put together, this is a little bit dated now, but idea like for vaccines and therapeutics for an exclusive license, where it's kind of sort of our historical data. So that we can kind of say, well, for certain markets, again, in the millions of dollars, and if we break it out, the technology in terms of low, medium, or high risk, and kind of some ballparks of where to start. And you can see there's a quite large range from small, high-risk markets to low-risk, large markets, but at least it gives you a starting point. You know, how maybe it's a order of magnitude type of estimate. But again, based upon that record, you can get a good estimate of where to start, or where your value might be. You can also take a look at some of the surveys, the public surveys from, say, Licensing Executive Society. So here, again, early stage, so that's most common from our facility, probably with yours as well. You can kind of see where the records for these years go up and down, but you can kind of see the values, what the minimum and the median values are pretty similar. So you're looking at a typically median value of a couple $100,000. So again, an idea of where the ballpark should be, particularly for upfront activities. You put say the median sort of in a sort of a distribution. You kind of see that here, the median value is in the $100,000 range. So you're probably looking at this a little older, so maybe you're looking at a little higher than 100, maybe 100 to 200,000 is pretty typical. But again, looking at your own historical data, you can put together a chart and kind of see where things might lie. Other thing you can look at is, particularly with the LES survey, is checking out sort of earned royalty rates. What are some of the royalty rates? It shows here, again, medians for, again, early stage, rates of somewhere between 3 and 5%. So you particularly things that are particularly hot, like maybe infectious disease, a little bit higher, but fairly range. And you can see there's a range, depending on where your particular asset might be, but pick a median value, again, somewhere in the 3 to 5% range. Another way, again, we looked at in terms of looking at sort of our valuation licenses, and we can see that, again, there's range of 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 10, depending on the company size, from our historical perspective. And some of this is influenced by materials, maybe things that are very difficult to make, such as transgenic mice, a little bit higher, things maybe are easier, such as monoclonal antibodies, perhaps a little lower. Again, so if someone asked me technology, what would I do a commercial evaluation license? Well, I've been thinking about this, and I'd say $5,000. And that certainly would be in the ballpark. Could be higher or lower depending on circumstances, but that's a good place to start. You can see we graph that, and we see that, oh, $5,000 is kind of where things sort out. So again, is using your own historical data or from other organizations such as LES, you can come up with some very good parameters so that newer people in your program can have an idea at least where to start, and then can work from there in terms of putting together an estimate on a project-by-project basis. Again, $5,000 is fairly typical historically for a one-year commercial evaluation license. We can also kind of break it out by materials. So you can actually sort it out by different types of materials that you might have. These are examples of reagents coming from our program. Most typical invention is obviously the new reagent for the next set of experiments. So you tend to have a lot of these compared to other types of inventions. So again, you can kind of see where these rates split out, these historic rates, by this type of collection. You argue a large company would probably pay a little more, but they probably have more users and also often will have contractors and other partners doing the work for them. So those tend to be a little bit higher. So another rule of thumb is the so-called 25% rule. And here, this is again put together over a number of years based on observations that often licensor and licensee split pre-tax profits at a 25% to 75% ratio. So that at 25%, that means that 25% should go to the licensor. At a profit margin of 20%, this means a 5% royalty on sales. This isn't a hard and fast rule. There's no legislation that mandates this. It's more of an observation. And it can be controversial at times. There's a whole issue of the Les Nouvelles, the LES Journal, and dedicated to this topic. But it's done pretty well over time in terms of, again, an observation based on how these things tend to sort out. So again, that's another way to come up with an estimate. Other rules of thumb you might think about: higher development risk, of course, lower running royalties. We see that often. Early stage technologies have lower running royalties. We saw that vaccines and therapeutics, 3 to 6%. Things that have lower risk or more developed have higher running royalties. So we see that in terms of research reagents, which don't require testing in humans or regulatory approval, higher rates, 12, 15, even up to 30% sometimes for that. You see higher rates also in consumer electronics. So again, where it's lower risk, the licensee is willing to pay a higher royalty rate. So that's one. Another approach would be the economic approach. And here we're looking at some financial analysis tools and get to do some math. So there's a lot of variations of this. We won't go into a lot today. But again, it's really based upon the economic principle that you think of the intellectual property as an income producing asset, and then what's the future income stream that this will throw off. And you discount that back to the present time, and that's the value. So people talk about it as net present value, NPV, or discounted cash flow. Pretty much the same idea, depending on which perspective you're looking at. So net present value, so here you're trying to calculate the value of an income producing asset, the license. And basically it's going to be the sum of the income streams for while the agreement is active, which each year's payment discounted back to the present. So you can see you have net income, the discount rate in terms of what the inflation rate or the time value of money, and the equation. So there is some math here, and very basic accounting type of activity. But again, it's something that you can think about in terms of an asset that you're licensing, what's going to be the future income stream for that in the future, and then what's the value back to you today. So you can think about it, though, is that you keep in mind the time value of money as well, something that threw off this type of royalty income, say in the first year of launch. You can see that as we go forward, that same amount of money discounted back to today, same amount of sales is actually lower. So again, you have to take that into account in terms of the activity. So what might be some of the rates used for that, for evaluating IP? These are kind of just general ideas. Everyone might have a slightly different thing for this, so these things certainly change by time. But you can see that there's quite a bit of difference when you're talking about things that are fairly certain, like T-bills or cash, versus things that all the way up to sort of corporate investment or VC investment, which really do expect a large return from that. So they have a very large discount rate in terms of their activities. So the other thing to keep in mind is that for early stage technologies, well, there's a fair amount of risk involved. If we could see the future perfectly, we would know whether that asset would come forward. But we have to adjust this. We're going to adjust for financial risk, which is the numbers we just talked about, but we also need to adjust by technology risk. And my colleague Ashley Stevens has done a lot of work with this, but basically is to make an estimate of how likely the technology is to prove out. And so you have the financial risk, and then you're going to also then multiply it by the technology risk. And with that, you get a risk-adjusted NPV, which is probably closer to what the actual cash value is today. Put together some tables here. This is just kind of a rough estimate, but the idea that you have a higher, in terms of life sciences, you have much higher probability of success. As closer you get to regulatory approval, that is de-risk. But preclinical assets, well, they're a bit risky. So you can see that going from start to finish, it really kind of is a low probability. So it's not an easy thing to move forward. It's not everyone's cup of tea in terms of taking on early stage technologies. And that's why we always hear from our company partners, what do we have in phase 2 clinical trials? But of course, most of our assets are preclinical. I'm sure you're hearing similar things, but again, when you do have later stage assets, they certainly have a higher value, and this is another example of it. So you can see that in terms of the valuation, it's kind of almost like a hockey stick here. In terms of the assets, as they get closer to regulatory approval, are much higher. It's not a linear relationship at all. So you need to reflect that in your license negotiations. So if you have some sort of payment that's contingent upon reaching phase 3 clinical trials, let's say, or reaching regulatory approval, it's not a linear relationship. It's actually a much stronger valuation that you want to put for those types of benchmarks, let's say. So and looking at the risk, there's a number of different factors you look at. These are all things that we're aware of in terms of the market, technology stage of development, how strong is your IP, how likely is it to issue, the license terms itself, exclusivity, we talked about, territory, field of use, so these are all things that go part of that. The stronger market, the stronger technology, the stronger IP, the stronger licensing terms, again, minimizes the risk and consequently higher value for our partners. Here's an example for a medical device, 6 remaining terms of patent. Again, say we do these projections, or at least you use this as an estimate. You can have the discounted cash flow. You can see at the bottom line. And then net present value here of 31 million. You add this all up. And then you adjust it for risk. Unless we're assuming for this example a 50% chance of success based upon where it is in development today. So you multiply that and you come out with half the value, so still $15 million. So you think about 15 million, where that would be in terms of your overall idea of value here. But at least you have the discounted cash flow, and also then you have the adjustment for the risk. So all that sort of works together well in terms of coming up with a value. Again, it's an estimate. You won't really be to the last dollar and decimal point, but gives you a sense of where it might be. So summarize, you take the value of the IP and you do the technology risk adjusted NPV, and you can make the estimates. You get revenues, life cycle risk, financial and technology. But you still want to use it in combination with other approaches. So this takes a fair amount of work, but again, the idea is that you have another approach that you can. And for later stage technologies, for business-to-business transactions, they'll have these sorts of numbers that will use this more typically. A fifth and final one, as we're getting close to the end of our time, we're talking about options. Here we have market values from buyers. So it'd be great if we could put our intellectual property valuations on eBay or some sort of activity. So what's been the experience for this? Well, experience has been is that it's very difficult. Early stage technologies are very difficult to value from auctions, and things are quite specialized. So when things have come forward, it's usually only been things in physical science that don't require regulatory approval, could go forward with this. That we're seeing some sort of new attempts to try to put this market, but this would be an ideal market for intellectual property, to have market valuations from buyers, so actually having a more efficient marketplace. Hasn't happened yet, but hopefully maybe something for the future, something to think about. So just to wrap it up here for our presentation today, just remind everyone that valuation is not an exact science. Again, as most of us are trained as scientists or engineers, this is a little bit of a disappointment because we really would like to see valuation have its own algorithm and come up with an exact number that everyone would agree to. It's not, and so it's part of the negotiation. Okay. Second point would be valuation can be a good start in getting information that you need at various stages. So again, you want to use your valuations to make decisions as to whether to continue patent prosecution, what kind of efforts you want to put in terms of marketing or other types of activities related to technology. So it's kind of help you with your overall process and your decision making as you go through the various stages of technology transfer during the life cycle. First, we'll use it to mitigate any uncertainty that surrounds the IP. You're going to no IP is ever perfect, but if it has a strong valuation, well, maybe it can carry forward, even if it has a little bit of difficulties, say at the patent office or other types of situations. So again, it's going to help you decide how to spend your time and effort on what cases really deserve the efforts and investment by your lab or by your program. And last but not least, you want to use multiple approaches whenever possible, because again, it's not an exact science, and you're really trying to get something where everyone is in a comfort level. And you want to have something because if you're at a disagreement with another party, you can ask them to show how did they do their valuation, and you can show them how you did your valuation and see if there's some middle ground or if perhaps one approach is the way to go. Because what you're looking for is to structure transactions that both parties believe in, are not trying to get out of as soon as they sign, and sort of overall work towards product development, make it a sort of win-win situation between the parties. So here's some more reading and more studies, some references that you can use. These are some basic ones. Some are online in the Autumn website. Others can be found as well. And I want to mention the upcoming Autumn Technology Transfer Evaluation course because I'm one of the co-organizers. We just finished one, and the next one will be at the Autumn National Meeting in New Orleans next year. And it's interesting because besides lectures and such, we have put the people into teams to work up case studies in both physical science and life science valuation. So if you're whichever part of the spectrum you work on, there's a case study, and we'll put you in a team to work that up. So I want to thank everyone for listening to the program today. And I want a special acknowledgement to my colleague, now retired, 𝐒𝐩𝐞𝐚, and a special tip of the hat to several of my colleagues in the tech transfer world. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to maybe having some questions in our remaining time.
Hi, Steve. How about this one? What are some reasonable expectations for T2 valuation income?
Well, I think the main expectation is don't count your chickens before they're hatched. I think we have to be very cautious about expectations, both in terms of the inventor and sometimes even the leadership. That it's not really seen as some sort of cash cow that's going to be paying expenses or funding necessarily new programs. Occasionally there are big payoffs, home runs, but they're kind of few and far between. So I think you have to focus more on providing small rewards to the inventors as your program matures, putting together good, strong deals, and being able to communicate the overall value of the program. We're not in this because it's going to make the government a lot of money. We're doing this to enhance the overall value and acceptance and transfer of the technology. So I think that's the main thing. The money will be nice in terms of rewarding inventors and covering some of the costs, but it's not a be-all and end-all of in itself.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the FLC, I would like to thank Steve Ferguson for this informative discussion and thank all of our attendees for joining us today. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available for viewing on the FLC Learning Center within a few days of this event, and it's included in your registration. Visit the FLC website, federallabs.org, to view the recording or any other webinar you may have missed. Please also remember to complete the webinar evaluation, which will be emailed to you within this week. This will help us serve your future needs. Thank you again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.